Hey, thanks very much for being here. I'm glad to have a chance to talk with you today about historical change in Pacific Northwest estuaries and what it means for salmon, people, and climate. This project, the project I'll be discussing, were funded by many different organizations, and we had a lot of different collaborators, and some of them are shown on this slide. I'm very grateful to all of them, and several of these projects were coordinated by the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership, which is a great organization that's making a big difference in estuary management on the West Coast. By the way, all the photos in these slides were taken by me, unless they're otherwise noted. So these are the messages I'd like to pass along today: the historical diversity of our Northwest estuary habitats and how that benefited fish and climate and people, and how Pacific Northwest estuaries have changed over the years and how we can use this information for our restoration and conservation planning. First, looking at the diversity of our Northwest estuary habitats, you know these basic classes of wetlands in the tidal areas. We have the lower intertidal seagrasses and algae beds, and then in the upper portions of the intertidal range, we have tidal marsh, also called salt marsh, and then a couple different kinds of what we call tidal swamp, which are dominated by woody vegetation. That would be basically trees or shrubs as the dominance with herbaceous understory. And these forested tidal swamps are pretty beautiful, magnificent environments, really. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures of examples from just different estuaries in Oregon. This is the Nehalem, and these are brackish wetlands, by the way, actually edging into the mesohaline during the late summer. Forested tidal swamp in the Aquinnah. A couple of freshwater systems in the Columbia, freshwater forested tidal wetlands. Brackish shrub wetland in the Siuslaw estuary. Here's one in the Columbia River estuary. And we learned about the diversity of our habitats historically through this study that I completed in 2019. And this was funded by PMEP as well as a couple other funders that are listed there. In this project, we compared wetland losses across these different habitat types, the marsh and the two types of swamp habitats, shrub and forested. We did this study in 15 estuaries on the Oregon coast. They comprise 97% of the historical tidal wetland area for our coast, so this was a comprehensive study. And the data inputs included the historical extent of the estuary from mapping that we did first in Oregon and subsequently for the whole U.S. West Coast. And you can download those data from the site here, the historical estuary extent layer. And then we got our current vegetation information from PMEP's biotic habitat layer, also shown on this page. Then historical vegetation came from originally from GLO records, General Land Office Survey records, and T-sheets. And these maps were compiled by John Christie and others. So we combined these sources to analyze changing vegetation on our coast since the 1800s. So in the upper left in this image, you see the historical estuary extent. That's this black line located and elevationally determined here. And then we used historical vegetation, lower left, from the mapping that I mentioned in the previous slide. Then diked areas came from a project that we did with the Oregon Coastal Management Program, where we mapped all the diked areas in Oregon. And then current vegetation, again, comes from PMEP's biotic component. And these four layers and their analysis are contained within that 2019 publication that I mentioned a moment ago. So by combining these layers, we can analyze losses due to diking as well as losses due to vegetation conversion. And what we learned was that historically, our tidal wetland habitats in Oregon were much more diverse than had previously been understood. Over half of our tidal wetlands were historically forested. And this is quite a paradigm shift for restoration and conservation planning because in general, those areas have focused on salt marsh or tidal marsh in the past. So we really advocate broadening the focus to include these forested tidal wetlands or tidal swamps. Here's an example from the Siuslaw River estuary. 75% of the historical tidal wetland area was swamp, mostly forested. 25% was tidal marsh. We did this work across the whole Oregon coast, as I mentioned, and overall, across all of the estuaries we analyzed, 58% of the historical tidal wetland area was swamp and 42% was marsh. So the majority of our tidal wetlands on the Oregon coast were forested. Actually, very few of these were shrub dominated. This was true in other parts of the Pacific Northwest as well. Here's some data coming from Graves in 1995 and analyzed within the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnerships Restoration Plan in 2012. 53% of the historical tidal wetland area in the whole Columbia Estuary was swamp, either shrub or forested, and again, that was mostly forested. 47% was tidal marsh. And it's true up in the Puget Sound area as well, and actually for the Pacific Northwest as a whole. This example is from the Snohomish, 87% swamp. And then, and these data come from Simonstead et al. 2011, the change analysis work. And across all the major river deltas, 2/3 of the historical tidal wetland area consisted of swamp. So this was true throughout the Northwest. It wasn't all about the tidal marsh. There was a lot of tidal swamp. Actually, the predominant type in our Northwest estuaries was not marsh, but swamp. And the diversity of these habitats really benefits fish and people and climate in some ways that I'd like to explain. So Greg Hood and his colleagues in 2018 made a statement that I thought was really effective and true. Salmon habitat isn't just tidal channels, it's also tidal marsh. And I've modified that slightly here based on our findings that the majority of our tidal wetlands, and this is the environment under which salmon evolved, the majority were actually forested tidal wetlands. So what we say now is salmon habitat is not just tidal channels, it's also tidal wetland in general. So some of the services that these forested wetlands provide to young salmon are deep and complex tidal channels full of abundant food or prey, and lots of large woody debris that creates refuge for these fish at low tide and refuge from predators as well. And beaver ponds are often a part of the picture. And because these forested and shrub tidal wetlands occur in salinity transition zones, they offer salt adjustment opportunities for these young fish before they go to the ocean. And Greg Hood did a study showing just how important these wetlands can be. He was working in the shrub tidal wetlands up in the Skagit River estuary in Puget Sound, and he found that Chinook capacity, carrying capacity for young Chinook at low tide, was 3 times greater in shrub wetlands that had beaver activity compared to tidal marsh, which didn't have these beaver ponds. And he stated that restoring this tidal shrub habitat is very important, not just to beaver, but to the fish as well. And other work by Isa Wu and colleagues in the Nisqually River Delta in Puget Sound found that a mosaic of habitat types provided abundant and diverse prey resources, which in turn support a diverse life history portfolio for the young salmon moving through these systems. I won't go through this in detail, but I just want to point out that tidal forests provide a different set of prey. This is a non-dimensional scaling analysis. Eelgrass beds, mudflats, salt marsh, each type of tidal wetland habitat has a different set of prey resources for fish. And that's really important, and therefore the timing of how fish use these habitats varies as well. And having diversity in the habitats leads to diversity in the fish population, which contributes to resilience. Corey Green and his colleagues looked at how Chinook salmon use different habitat types in Puget Sound tidal deltas. These are the 4 habitats that they looked at: mudflat, tidal marsh, tidal forested wetland, and then this shrub transition zone that's tidal as well. They found, similar to what Wu and her colleagues found, that fish use varies across time in these different habitats. Different cohorts of fish use the different habitats at different times. The purple here was marsh. This shows growth potential. You can see the high fish growth potential in these tidal forested wetlands. So Green and his team concluded that habitat diversity is important for maximizing young salmon growth. And again, that restoration planning should focus on habitat diversity as well as habitat capacity to support the salmon population recovery and resilience. So how do these habitats benefit climate and people that depend on climate? Well, I'm sure you've all heard of blue carbon. That's the carbon that's captured and stored in the tidal wetlands, like tidal marshes and tidal swamps, stored both in the soil and in the above ground parts. And in this study that Boone Kaufman led, published in 2020, our team documented carbon storage in all these different tidal wetland habitats, including seagrass, low marsh, high marsh, and tidal forest. And we found that the rates of carbon storage in these tidal wetlands were very, very high. In fact, this graph shows how our wetlands compare to global averages. And you can see here are global averages for tidal marsh, and here are Pacific Northwest study sites. This is across 37 different sites in the Northwest. High marsh and low marsh tended to exceed global averages, but the highest of all carbon storage occurred in our Pacific Northwest tidal forested wetlands, which exceeded all other global averages, including the closest, which was mangroves. How do these tidal forests compare to other forest environments in the Northwest? You can see that they're as high as coastal old growth and higher than sort of averages for coast range forests and upland forests. So now that we know how much these different diverse tidal wetland habitats benefit us, it's good to know how they've changed so we know what the level of impact is and what we need to aim for in terms of restoration. So I'm going to go back to this same study from 2019 and show you some of what we learned. So from the Oregon coast, we found that the loss of historical tidal swamp was 95%. So a near eradication of our tidal swamps has occurred from the Oregon coast. The loss of tidal marsh was about 60%, and a fair bit of that has been gained back through restoration and accretion. This is a bar chart showing the same thing, so you can see the composition of the historical array of tidal wetlands was over half swamp, and now it's only less than 20% swamp, and the total is much less as well. And this was true in individual estuaries varying from one to the other in terms of magnitude. In Tillamook, 63% of the tidal wetlands historically were forested, but 92% of those have been lost. In the Coquille, which is the most extreme case, 84% of our historical tidal wetlands were forested, and almost 100% of those have been lost. Again, these figures and the general conditions are true throughout the Northwest. So in the Columbia River estuary, there's been a loss of 82% of forested tidal wetlands versus around 30 to 35 of other habitat types. And for Puget Sound, a 90% loss of forested tidal wetlands, 99% of shrub versus 46% for marsh. So how do we use this information? What do we do? As stated by the estuary technical group for the Columbia River, we need to reestablish the complexity of the estuarine landscape in time and in space using historical conditions as a guideline or a template. And that means focusing on some of these specific habitat types in different geographic areas where they've been most impacted. Many coastal groups are now prioritizing forested tidal wetland restoration. And there are a number of projects that have looked at methods for doing this. The basic steps are similar to other tidal wetland restoration. Choose appropriate sites, restore tidal flows, plant woody species, but there are some challenges related to things like soil subsidence and compaction and the loss of channel system complexity, which in the dike system is much less. Reed canary grass can be a problem, but we are finding that we can overcome this through things like nurse logs and log cribs to support young saplings planted in reed canary grass areas. And soil mounds can be useful too, as Diefendorfer and her team showed. So overall, I hope I've showed you that we can prioritize the habitats that have been most impacted, that we have some techniques that are now being developed to do that, and that all this work is very important. And I want to encourage you to download data from the sites that I've linked here and explore these applications to understand the historical conditions of our estuaries and to help bring back our tidal swamps.